Okay, I'd like to welcome you to this public meeting of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is just one meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine the renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1, 2016, and on or before September 30th, 2017. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Harvey Epstein.
Present.
Stephen Flax.
Present.
Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Cecilia Hosa. Sabir Rahman.
Present.
Helen Schaub.
Present.
Mary Sarafi.
Present.
Scott Walsh.
Present.
And Kathleen Roberts, I'm here. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The next meeting of this board will be a public hearing. In all, there will be 5 public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines. They will be held on the following dates, times, and locations. Thursday, June 9th, public hearing at Jamaica Performing Arts Center Auditorium, 153-10 Jamaica Avenue in Jamaica, New York, 11432, if that matters, 5:30 to 8:30. Monday, June 13th, St. Francis College Founders Hall, 180 Remsen Street in Brooklyn, 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. Thursday, June 16th, Bronx Museum of Art Lower Gallery, 1040 Grand Concourse in the Bronx, 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. Monday, June 20th, the Great Hall at Cooper Union, 7 East 7th Street in Manhattan, 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. And Tuesday, June 21st, Oberia D. Dempsey Multi-Service Center Auditorium, 127 West 127th Street in Manhattan, 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. Directions to these hearings can be found on our website, nycrgb.org, in the About Us section, Meeting Schedule. You can sign up by calling the Rent Guidelines Board offices at 212-669-7480, and as always, there are copies of our meeting schedule here today. The final vote will take place on June 27th, starting at 6:30 p.m. It will be held in the Great Hall at Cooper Union, 7 East 7th Street, at the corner of 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. In your folder, you will find copies of the 2016 Housing Supply Report and changes to the rent-stabilized housing stock in New York City in 2015, both of which will be presented this morning. Copies of the reports are here today, and they will be posted on our website after the meeting. After the presentation of the RGB reports, we have guest speakers from HPD, Leila Bozorg, the Commissioner Bean's Chief of Staff, and Elizabeth Galmer, Assistant Commissioner of Research and Evaluation. In addition, we will hear from Stephanie Rossoff, Data Manager and Research Analyst at the new NYU Furman Center, regarding their annual State of the City's Housing and Neighborhoods report. And finally, all submissions received through May 27th from owners, tenants, and public officials regarding this year's guidelines are also in your folders.
Can I ask about HCR?
Yes. They unfortunately had a scheduling conflict. Deputy Commissioner Woody, I understand, is in Albany, sends his apologies.
So we ask questions, are they going to answer them?
Andrew.
Yeah, I asked them about that. They should be getting to us shortly. They're still waiting on some data points to finish.
This is 2 years in a row where the agency that's regulating rent-stabilized housing has failed to appear before us, and I think it's troubling at least. And if we are saying that we're not going to schedule another time to meet with them, we should at least put something in writing that articulates a concern, and I have a serious concern that they just aren't available and there's no one in the entire agency who can come talk to us. He may be in Albany, but there's probably 500 people that work there.
Let me confer with Andrew and maybe draft something and circulate it for people to take a look at. I agree. I'm disappointed. there are a lot of things that I think they can contribute to our discussion. So I agree, publicly expressing our disappointment probably makes some sense. So I'll take a stab at that. Okay, any other matters of general concern, observation, questions? Okay, I think that means we're going to move to the housing supply report. Up.
Good morning. The Rent Stabilization Law requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider the overall supply of housing accommodations and overall vacancy rates. Therefore, our research staff produces an annual housing supply report which highlights year-to-year changes and trends in the supply of residential housing in New York City with a focus on findings from the 2014 Housing and Vacancy Survey, new construction and demolition data, conversions and subdivisions, cooperative and condominium activity, housing rehabilitation, and government housing programs and funding. The major findings of this year's housing supply report are 56,528 permits were issued in 2015 for dwelling units, an increase of 176.0%. The number of new housing units completed in 2015 rose to 14,357, a 21.0% increase over the prior year. City-sponsored residential constructing will add 20,327 new housing units to the residential stock, 58% of which are rehabilitation projects. Demolitions increased 24.7% to 1,887 in 2015. And there was a 106.2% increase in the number of units in co-op or condo plans approved in 2015 to 19,742 units, while the number of approved plans grew by 64.4%. The number of units constructed with 421A certificates decreased by 21.3% to 5,468. The number of units newly receiving J51 abatements or exemptions increased by 8.5% to 44,259. In addition, 12.2% of all rental housing is considered overcrowded, and the citywide vacancy rate was 3.45% in 2014. Preliminary findings from the 2014 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the triennial survey of the city's housing stock, were released to the public last year. We presented HVS findings in our earlier income and affordability study, and we report on data related to the city's housing stock for this presentation. New York City is unique in that a significant share of its housing is renter-occupied. The HVS reports approximately 2/3 of the city's housing stock is renter-occupied, compared to 36.5% for the nation as a whole. New York City has more than 2.1 million rental units, and slightly less than half of those are rent-stabilized. Citywide, the New York City vacancy rate in 2014 was 3.45%. Vacancy rates also vary by rent regulation status. The HVS found a tight market among pre-war stabilized units with a vacancy rate of 2.29% in 2014. Post-war stabilized units also maintained a low vacancy rate at 1.63%, while private, non-regulated units were vacant at a 5.6% rate. The HVS reports that overcrowding varies by rent regulation status, with the highest rates among the stabilized stock. Overall, 12.2% of all rental housing in New York City is overcrowded. That is, there is more than one person per room on average, and 4.7% is severely overcrowded. That is, there is an average of over 1.5 persons per room. Pre-war stabilized housing is most crowded, with 15.0% overcrowded and 6.1% severely overcrowded, while post-war units are overcrowded at a rate of 14.6%, with severe overcrowding at a 5.5% rate. Private, non-regulated housing is slightly less overcrowded at 11.3%, with 4.2% severely overcrowded. As this pie chart illustrates, about 2/3 of New York City's occupied housing stock is renter-occupied. The largest share is private, non-regulated rentals, 39%, followed by pre-war stabilized, 35%, other regulated units at 13%, post-war stabilized, 12%, and rent-controlled units, 1%. Examining the number of building permits issued annually helps to determine the amount of new housing planned each year. Permit approvals for new dwelling units in 2015 increased by 176.0% to 56,528, the sixth consecutive year of increase. Permits rose in all boroughs except Staten Island, including Brooklyn, which rose by the most proportionally, up 244.7% to 26,026 units. Queens also saw an increase in permits, up 158.5% to 12,667 units, while permits issued in the Bronx rose 148.4% to 4,682 permits. And permits in Manhattan rose by 132.1% to 12,612 units. But permits fell in Staten Island by 24.0% to 541 units. First quarter 2016 permits decreased by 65.1% in comparison to the number of permits issued during the first quarter of 2015, including double-digit decreases in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens, down 86.5%, 74.3%, and 52.9% respectively, but increases in both the Bronx and Staten Island by 54.4% and 29.5% respectively. You can see from this graph that residential building permits increased 176.0% and are now higher than the last peak in 2008. While the city overall had a 176.0% increase in permits to 56,528 citywide, this map shows the number of permits by borough in 2015 and the change from 2014. As already noted, permits rose by double digits in Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, but fell by double digits in Staten Island. Permit data can also be analyzed more deeply by looking at the reported size of buildings applying for permits. In 2015, a total of 1,998 buildings received permits. Citywide, 23.5% of these buildings were single-family, 19.2% were two-family, 10.0% were three- or four-family structures, and 47.3% were buildings with 5 or more units. This is by far the highest proportion of 5 or more unit buildings since at least 1996, the first year data is available. As this chart illustrates, almost all building permits in Manhattan and Brooklyn were for the largest buildings, while in Staten Island, virtually all permits were for either 1 or 2 family buildings. Another way of measuring the level of housing creation is to look at the number of housing units actually completed in a given year, which in 2015 increased. In 2015, there were 14,357 new housing completions citywide, a 21.0% increase over the prior year. Increases were seen in all boroughs, including the Bronx, which rose by 44.3%, Manhattan, which rose by 33.8%, Brooklyn, which rose by 18.7%, Queens, up 5.0%, as well as Staten Island, up 2.1%. New housing is also created by various programs sponsored by the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Through these programs, the agency reported 20,327 housing starts in fiscal year 2015, 58% of which were rehabilitations, and an increase of 126.1% over fiscal year 2014. The 421A program, currently expired, was designed to encourage new construction of multifamily housing. Owners were exempt from paying additional real estate taxes on the increased value of the property due to the new construction. Exemptions lasted for 10 to 25 years, and rental properties must abide by all rent regulations during benefits. Participation has been rather variable in recent years, with both significant increases and decreases, but for the fourth consecutive year, the number of new 421A exemptions fell, decreasing 21.3%. A total of 5,468 units newly received 421A benefits in 2015, with 38.5% of those units in Brooklyn and 33.0% in Manhattan. While 25.5% of units were in Queens, the Bronx contained 2.8% of the units newly receiving 421A benefits and 0.2% in Staten Island. Newly certified 421A units went down in every borough but Staten Island during 2015, although the number of rental units fell by a lesser amount, 9.5%, with increases in Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. As you can see in this graph, the number of apartment units newly receiving 421A benefits decreased for the fourth consecutive year. To meet demand in the housing market, office buildings and manufacturing space are sometimes converted into residential housing, or a residential building is subdivided into additional units. A number of SRO building owners have filed to convert their buildings to other uses, such as tourist hotels. In 2015, 165 of these applications were accepted, up 57 applications from the 108 accepted during the prior year. More than 40% of New York City's owner-occupied housing is in the form of co-ops and condos. Construction of new co-ops and condos, which increase the supply of owner-occupied housing, and the conversion of rental housing to co-op or condo status, which reduces the supply of rental housing, have to be accepted by the Attorney General's office. The number of co-op and condo plans filed in 2015 with the Attorney General increased 64.4%, with a total of 439 plans containing 19,742 units, a 106.2% increase in units. This is the fourth consecutive year of increase in accepted co-op and condo units. Similar to recent years, a majority of the 2015 plans were for new construction, a total of 14,578 new units in 342 plans, and 4,106 units in 37 plans were for non-eviction conversions, with the remaining 1,058 units in rehabilitation and conversion eviction plans. Almost half of plans accepted were located in Brooklyn, with 48% of the share of accepted co-op and condo plans. And the majority of units within these plans were located in Manhattan, with 58% of the share of units citywide. As this graph shows, the number of accepted units in co-op and condo plans increased for the fourth consecutive year. The purple bar represents the proportion of accepted units that are condos, and the blue bars are accepted co-op units. In 2015, almost all accepted units were condos. Another tax abatement and exemption program available to owners has been the J51 program. J51 was designed to encourage rehabilitation of residential units. As with the 421A program, J51 benefits are available to both rental as well as owner-occupied units. Eligible activities include MCIs, moderate or substantial rehabilitation, and conversion from non-residential use if substantial government assistance is provided. 44,259 units were newly approved for J51 benefits in 2015, an 8.5% increase from the prior year. While citywide, the number of newly approved J51 benefits rose, at the borough level, increases were seen only in the Bronx, which rose 35.4%, Queens, which rose 24.0%, and in Staten Island, which rose 309.6%. In Manhattan, the number of newly approved units fell 22.9% and fell by 20.6% in Brooklyn. This chart shows the fluctuation in the number of housing units newly receiving J51 benefits since 1993. As you can see, levels increased 8.5% in 2015. Another part of the city's housing stock are those buildings that the city has taken title to in the past for non-payment of taxes. The city in recent years has developed new policies to deal with the non-payment of taxes, including anti-abandonment and third-party transfer programs. In the meantime, it continues to divest itself of the buildings it already owns, and since 1994 has reduced the number of vacant and occupied in-rem housing by at least 99.0%. leaving a total of just 419 units managed by the city at the end of fiscal year 2015, down from a peak of almost 100,000 units in 1986. This is a decrease of 45.0% over the prior fiscal year. The New York City Department of Buildings tracks the number of buildings which are demolished each year, which increased in 2015 for the third consecutive year, rising 24.7% to reach 1,887 buildings. By borough, Brooklyn had 35.4% of all buildings demolished in 2015, a rise of 47.1%. Queens had a 32.4% share, a rise of 10.3%. Staten Island accounted for 14.1% of building demolitions, a rise of 3.1%. Manhattan had an 11.9% share, a rise of 86.0%. And the Bronx had the smallest share of buildings demolished, 6.1%, a fall of 7.2%. So in conclusion, the number of building permits increased by 176.0% and are now at their highest level since 2008. While housing units completed increased by 21.0% to 14,357 units, and the in-rem housing stock decreased. In addition, 106.2% more units were approved for co-ops and condos, but 21.3% less units were built with 421A tax incentives, while 8.5% more units were rehabilitated with J51 tax incentives. And demolitions increased, rising by 24.7%. And the vacancy rate was 3.45%, less than the 5% legal threshold required for the continuation of rent stabilization. Thank you. If there are any questions?
Thank you, Danielle. Any questions for Danielle? Yeah, Xavier.
Just a quick question. Is there any sense of why the number of new construction has gone down so much in the first quarter of 2016, or is that just what is the data?
I'm sorry, you say the number of permits went down?
The first quarter of 2016, because of 420,
We can assume it's from 421A. Yeah.
When did it expire exactly? What was the sunset date?
It was,
See, Jim.
Do you know why the number of 421A permits was already decreasing before the expiration?
those are units that were newly certified. That means they're being completed. So the new permits, assuming that these new permits were all actually built and actually got 421A, you'll see a bump in the 421A numbers in 2, 3, 4 years.
I see, okay, thank you. Yeah, Harvey?
Yeah, I also had questions on the tax lien data. I'm wondering if you looked at how many tax lien units were taken in 2015 and whether there's a change in the number of tax lien units that were taken.
What, I couldn't hear your question.
I was
I'm
asking her about tax liens and
Yes.
with the tax lien unit numbers, if we saw an increase or decrease and what the implications are.
No, I don't think we have that specific information.
Maybe HPD can give it to us, or if we can't, maybe you can get it.
Well, I'd have to ask HPD for it.
Emma, do we know how many units have mortgages on them? Do we have a proportionality? Because it would never go into tax lien because the bank would just pay the taxes even if the person was involved.
Right, so there might be very...
Somewhat inaccurate.
Well, the question would be how many units went into tax liens, how many were foreclosed through the tax lien process. So we would know if they went in tax liens and they were bought out of tax liens, there was no foreclosure going forward.
Could you use your microphone, Scott?
Yeah, Scott, can you speak into your mic? Thanks.
And then the demolition numbers, how many of those have rent-stabilized units in it, do you know?
No, we don't even have a number of units. We can only get the number of buildings.
But anyone who does a demolition project where there's a rent-stabilized tenant in the unit and they want to remove the rent-stabilized tenant, have to apply to HCR for a demolition permit to get the rent-stabilized tenants out.
But Brian might have those numbers in his changes report, but I don't track those numbers.
It would be great to get that number too, if we're seeing 10% of the demolitions are with rent-stabilized tenants versus 90% of the units with rent-stabilized tenants for demolition. It'd be interesting to see that.
Yeah, it's in the changes report. If they filed with the other unit.
It's in the
It
changes report.
should be in the changes report if the owner
To the
filed.
extent we have that information. To the extent that was given to DHCR.
Well, the HCR has it, because they're the ones who approve demolition applications for buildings that have rent-stabilized tenants in them.
Right.
So they have it. So the question is whether we have it from them.
Okay, well, let's hear from Brian. Are there, yeah, Sebio?
The question. So is there any way to extrapolate how much of the new permits and completing new buildings are affordable units or like projected to be affordable units, given sort of the policy changes, or we can't guess that?
No. I mean, I have the number in here of what this city has reported from HPD and HDC is what they're doing in terms of the affordable units, but otherwise, I'm not sure.
Yeah, Steve?
Just, I'm curious, on page 4, the pie chart, the breakdown between renters and homeowners, where would NYCHA be in this pie chart, or is it excluded?
No, it would be in here lumped in with other regulated. If you want the exact number, I can get that for you.
I'm just curious, so it's embodied in
Yeah, it's-
regulated, but it's, okay,
Yeah, other regulated would include,
depending when it was built, like, but they would mostly all be
no, it would all of the NYCHA housing would be
in here.
in other regulated.
Other project-based,
Project.
Yeah, this would be Mitchell Lama's NYCHA project-based Section 8, HUD, couple other few things.
Mary?
Just to clarify, the 56,528, those are new buildings or just permits pulled,
It's new construction.
all new construction?
Yeah.
Any other questions for Danielle?
Yeah, can you tell from these permits, like, how it breaks down per quarter, like where permits being pulled at the end of third and fourth quarter of the
Yeah,
year?
there's an appendix in the
Okay.
back. It's
See it, right.
Appendix 3 on page 17.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
That appendix is new this year. Very excited about that one, so.
Had a feeling the question was coming.
Other questions for Danielle? General observations or questions? Nope? Okay, then I think we can move on to hear from Brian on the changes report.
Sorry, I'm holding the water bottle just a little bit. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. Morning. Let's get set up here. Rent regulation has been a fixture in New York City's housing market for over 7 decades, although the laws that govern rent-regulated housing have been substantially changed and modified over time, including most recently with the passage of the Rent Act of 2015. In addition to legislative changes, the existing laws allow for dynamic changes in the regulatory status of a significant portion of the rent-regulated housing stock in any given year. Units enter, exit, or change status within the regulatory system. This report is an update of previous studies done annually since 2003. These totals do not represent every unit that has been added or subtracted from the rent-stabilized stock, but rather those that have been recorded or registered by various city and state agencies. They represent a floor in most cases, or a minimum count of the actual number of newly regulated and deregulated units in these years. Since newly constructed or substantially rehabilitated units are exempt from rent regulation, increases to the regulated housing stock are often a result of owners placing these new units under rent stabilization in exchange for tax benefits. Events that lead to the addition of stabilized units include Section 421A tax exemption program, which recently expired, the J51 property tax exemption and abatement program, Mitchell-Lama buyouts, lofts converted to rent-stabilized units, as well as rent-controlled apartments that convert to rent stabilization. Tax exemption and abatement programs have a significant impact on the inventory of stabilized housing. Apartments newly created with the aid of these programs must typically remain rent-stabilized for at least the duration of their benefits. In 2015, 2,515 units were added to the stabilized stock through the 421A program, 19% fewer than in the prior year. The largest number of units were in Brooklyn, 888, followed by Queens, 716, Manhattan, 558, and the Bronx, 353. There weren't any on Staten Island. And according to DHCR, the median legal rent of registered rent-stabilized apartments currently receiving 421A tax abatements in 2015 was $3,435. And this year, there were no J51 units that newly received benefits added to the stabilized stock, compared to 243 in the prior year. Other additions in 2015 include lofts that were converted to stabilized status, adding 18 units, down slightly from the 21 in the prior year. There were 270 units that were decontrolled and became rent stabilized, 28% more than in the prior year. And there were no Mitchell-Lama rental units that were added to the stabilized stock this past year, compared to 318 in the prior year. Summing up all the additions we've discussed so far, there were a total of 2,803 units added to the stabilized stock in 2015, 28% fewer than in 2014, when 3,903 units were added. Of these newly registered rent-stabilized apartments in 2015, the median legal registered rent was $2,167. Historically, one of the largest sources of additions to the stabilized housing stock were 420C units. The 420C program, a tax exemption program for low-income housing projects developed in conjunction with the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, produces affordable housing with rents that are regulated but not necessarily rent stabilized. The RGB from 2003 to 2014 erroneously assumed that all rental units that were recipients of 420C tax benefits were rent stabilized. However, upon review, we were unable to verify the number of units that actually entered rent stabilization in this time period. Therefore, the RGB has removed these additions that were attributed to the 420C program between 2003 and 2014, a total of 39,227 units. And Appendix 1, which looks at each year going back, looks at the number of additions, that's been revised to reflect the removal of these units. Now we'll move on to the subtraction of units from rent stabilization. Deregulation of stabilized units occur because of statutory requirements or because of physical changes to the residential dwellings. Events that lead to the removal of stabilized units include high rent, high income deregulation, high rent vacancy deregulation, co-op condo conversions, expiration of 421A benefits and J51 benefits, substantial rehabilitation, conversion to commercial or professional status, as well as other losses to the housing stock, such as demolitions, which Harvey, you were asking about earlier, condemnations, mergers, etc. The largest number of subtractions from the stabilized stock were due to high rent vacancy deregulation, which since June 2015 occurs when the legal regulated rent of an apartment can reach $2,700 or more after being vacated. According to DHCR rent registration records of those owners who filed, at least 8,049 units were deregulated in 2015 under high rent vacancy deregulation, an increase of 29% from the number deregulated in the prior year, and it represents almost three-quarters, 74% of all units removed from stabilization in 2015. The other type of deregulation that occurs is high rent, high income deregulation, when the rent reaches the current figure of $2,700 and household income exceeds $200,000. High rent, high income deregulation removed 109 apartments in 2015. That was 41% fewer than in the prior year. This graph shows the minimum number of units that have left the stabilized stock over the past 2+ decades, since state law first permitted deregulation of units with rents above $2,000 upon vacancy in 1994. That increased to $2,500 in 2011, and then to $2,700 last June. The graph shows the increase that occurred annually in most years through 2009, followed by a decline each year until 2013, and then increases again in each of the last 2 years. During this entire period, from 1994 to 2015, at least 147,457 units were registered with DHCR as being deregulated due to high rent vacancy deregulation. This graph shows the number of units that left the stabilized housing stock due to high rent, high income deregulation since 1994, when it was first permitted. Over this period, at least 6,093 units have been deregulated due to high rent, high income deregulation. In every year except 2009 and 1994, which was the initial year that high rent, high income deregulation was permitted, the number of units registered as deregulated due to high rent, high income has been less than 400 units each year, including this past year when 109 were deregulated. As I said, a 41% decline from the prior year and the fifth decrease in the last 6 years. Apartments left rent stabilization for other reasons as well. Co-op condo status conversions, which include both newly converted units as well as stabilized tenants vacating apartments in previously converted buildings, totaled 618 units, 22% fewer than the prior year. Expiration of 421A benefits resulted in a total of 1,079 units removed from the stabilization system, 7% more than the prior year. Expiration of J51 benefits resulted in a total of 287 units removed, more than double the number from the prior year. 288 units were removed from stabilization due to substantial rehabilitation, 27% more than in the prior year. In addition, 13 units were converted to non-residential use, the same as in the prior year. Other losses to the stabilized housing stock, such as the merger of pre-existing units or demolition, resulted in 369 additional units leaving the stabilized housing stock, 11% fewer than in the prior year. So summing up the subtractions, at least 10,812 units left stabilization in 2015, 20% more than in the prior year. So if we look at the sum of both the additions and subtractions to the stabilized housing stock in 2015, the study found an estimated net loss of 8,009 units to the stabilized housing stock. The vast majority of additions to the stabilized stock this past year were the result of the 421A tax incentive program, which represented 90% of the additions. Meanwhile, high rent vacancy deregulation was the largest source of measured subtractions from the stabilized housing stock in 2015, accounting for 74% of the total number of subtractions. This table, which is also reproduced in the report, if you have trouble reading it, is the total number of additions and subtractions from all the programs in 2015. It includes 2,803 additions to the stabilized stock and 10,812 units removed from rent stabilization. Taking the difference between the additions and subtractions results in a net loss to the stabilized housing stock in 2015 of 8,009 units. This graph shows the net loss in the total number of apartments removed from rent stabilization since 2003, the first year the RGB examined this data in an annual report, through the most recent year, 2015. The study found a net loss of 8,009 rent-stabilized units. As I said, in 2015, that was 57% more units lost than in 2014, when the adjusted net loss was 5,110 units. Cumulatively, the graph shows a net decline of 108,246 rent-stabilized units since 2003. And this figure does factor in the removal of 420C units that I mentioned earlier that had been previously assumed to be stabilized from 2003 to 2014. And while not shown on the graph, the RGB has, since 1994, counted 125,555 additions to the stabilized stock and 276,777 subtractions from the stabilized stock, resulting in a net loss of stabilized units of at least 151,222 units since 1994. And those numbers going back to 1994 are in the appendices in the report. And that is the changes to the report. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
I had one question.
Sure, Helen, go ahead.
Yeah, see, it's hidden. So you were mentioning that these are the minimum numbers in terms of units removed from rent stabilization. It seems like, because there's not clarity on whether all units that are removed are registered as removed, do we have any, has anybody taken a look at what percentage we think are actually registered as removed?
Well, in earlier years, there was no requirement by DHCR to register all the high rent deregulated units, vacancy deregulated units. I think that there is more of a requirement now that they do notify the tenant and file with DHCR, so the numbers are better in that regard. And there are other instances, I'm sure, where they're not filed, but it's tough to quantify.
And do we know when the requirement went in?
I believe it was in 2014.
We did have a question earlier about, if you know, which in the other housing or other subtractions number for demolitions, was there a
It's not
total?
broken out, demolitions, but it's grouped with a couple of other categories from DHCR. I don't think,
So you don't have a breakout for demolitions?
no.
Okay.
Could you get how many buildings were subject to demolitions and how many units were in those buildings and how many were occupied rent-stabilized tenants?
That would be a question for DHCR. I don't think they group it together. I mean, I think they group it together in the way they provide
Unfortunately,
it.
they're not coming.
Right. It might be a question, if you add it to the list of questions, maybe, if they'll answer.
I can certainly follow the questions, but not only do you want the demolition, but to see if there was an occupied tenant that
I
was in
mean,
the...
so you could have a demolition of a 10-unit building, but you might only have one rent-stabilized tenant in, but you're still losing all 10 units, even
Right,
though there's
sure.
only one occupied tenant left. And
Other
Brian-
questions for Brian?
I'm sorry, Brian, you mentioned net loss versus actual loss. What's the actual number of rent-stabilized units that were taken off the market versus the net loss, which then includes the increase of 421 and other units? What's the net loss? What's the actual loss, sorry?
Well, the subtractions are broken down in the appendices, if you want to look at it. By category and borough, it's in appendices, Appendix 7. If you look at Appendix 6, it's going back to 1994 by category, but not by borough.
So according to 6, you're saying there's a total of 276,000 rent-stabilized units lost, but there might be additions for 421A.
Additions would be found on Appendix 1. All the additions are totaled going back to 1994. And the additions by borough for the past year only is in Appendix 2.
Thank you.
Also new to this report, Appendix 3, we give a breakdown of the average and median rents for for initially registered stabilized units by borough as well. That's on page 12.
Actually, I'm sorry, we do have subtractions going by by borough as well in Appendix 5 to 1994.
Initially registered units, yeah. So, for example, the initially registered units in the Bronx, the average rent was $1,452. The median rent was $1,434. And then we do that for each borough. Staten Island it didn't have enough units to report those, but, and then obviously the citywide number as well.
Mary, you had a question?
Have we ever looked at Article 11, tax abatement
I think your
program?
microphone is off. But
No, it's not.
Have we looked at Article 11 program, tax abatement?
Article 11, I'm not familiar with that.
That may, since the 420C is now not included, Article 11 may be able to provide more information on units that will be coming in that are rent stabilized. Maybe we can ask.
Well, that would be a question for...
I think HPD is the agency that provides them, so...
HPD does not determine whether or not it's rent stabilized. From our, it's the HCR that may or may not indicate that. So we can look at that as a question, maybe, if you want to I don't know if you want to add that to the list, or you want to do it for next year.
No, I think Mary's right, that it would, when the 420C unit is completed, there's a question of whether they were rent stabilized or not. It's important to note that they're all rent regulated, but they're not necessarily rent stabilized. And so we quantify that was the issue, and I'm not sure how many that are in the 420C, and there's been some changes to that law as well over the last, I think in 2004, there were some changes to it, and so, but we could try to get some information more on it. We're looking into it, and we're not.
I just think Article 11 may be something that a lot of developers may be using now, since the 421A has expired, and you may be able to get more data.
Yeah, I mean,
We can ask Deeds here.
we've noticed that the 420Cs in recent year had gone up, and they became a bigger portion of the addition. So yeah, you're absolutely right that more owners or developers are taking advantage of the 420.
Other questions for Brian? No? Okay, thank you, Brian.